The snow came down in heavy sheets, soft but merciless, each flake clinging to the empty branches of the park trees and piling onto the ground, until the world seemed buried in white. The lamps along the path glowed faintly, their halos blurred by the storm, throwing long, trembling shadows across the rusted bench at the center of it all. On that bench, the small bodies sat pressed together, swallowed by a single oversized coat. It was too big for them, too thin for this kind of cold, but it was all they had. Lena, the older one, barely 6, tightened her arm around her younger sister, Emma, pulling her close as if her tiny arms could build a fortress against the winter. Their breasts rose in small, trembling clouds, lips cracked and skin flushed red from the frost. Snowflakes clung to their lashes like tiny crystals, as though the sky itself mocked their tears. Hours had passed since their mother slipped into the night with no promise of return. At first Lena had told Emma she would be back, that they only had to wait. But as the hours stretched and the cold dug deeper into their bones, that hope withered. Lena's voice, once soft and protective, grew hollow when she whispered, "No one's coming for us. No one ever does." Emma buried her face against her sister's chest, the collar of the coat dampening with her tears, her small hands trembling as they clutched at the sleeve. She was only 4, too young to understand abandonment fully, but old enough to feel the crushing silence of being left behind. Round them, the city kept moving. Cars glided past in the distance, their headlights slicing through the storm, but none slowed down. Figures walked along the sidewalks with scarves pulled tight and hats drawn low, too hurried or too hardened to notice the children fading into the snow. The world had turned its back, and the night was closing in. Then came the sound that broke the endless hush of the storm. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the frozen path. Lena lifted her head, her wide eyes searching through the veil of snow. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, shoulders squared, wrapped in a heavy blue coat lined with fur. His polished shoes seemed out of place against the ice, as though he did not belong in this forgotten corner of the city. The snow caught in his dark hair and beard, but his stride remained steady, powerful. When his gaze fell on the 2 girls, he stopped. Daniel Cross. The name was printed across skylines, etched into steel towers that touched the clouds. To the world, he was a millionaire CEO, ruthless in negotiations, untouchable in power, a man whose heart was said to be as cold as the glass of his offices. But here, beneath the storm's unyielding silence, he was only a man staring at 2 fragile children trembling beneath the coat. He exhaled, his breath sharp in the air, and for a moment he did not move. Something had struck him, something deep and buried. The sight of their small faces peeking from the collar of that coat, eyes glazed with desperation. He felt his chest tighten with an ache he had long ignored. Slowly, as though afraid to frighten them, he stepped closer. The snow crunched louder under his weight, echoing in the still park. Kneeling, Daniel removed his gloves, the cold biting at his skin, but his voice came soft, steadier than he felt inside. "Hey," he whispered, "are you all right?" Lena's body stiffened, her lips pressed together as her eyes darted between his face and the shadows around him. Instinct warned her not to trust strangers. Yet when she met his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in days. Warmth, not pity, not curiosity, but warmth. Emma whimpered softly, clutching her sister tighter, as if afraid the man might vanish like everyone else had. Daniel's pulse quickened at the sight of their trembling hands, their fragile breaths. He knew this was no accident of circumstance. This was neglect, abandonment, a crime written in the snow at his feet. And though the storm raged harder, though the world might turn its eyes away, Daniel Cross, the man known for his coldness, felt something break open inside him. He leaned closer, his voice breaking through the storm. "Don't cry. I'm here now." The night swallowed his words, but the promise in them lingered like a flame in the dark. Snow still poured from the heavens, blanketing the park in silence. But the silence inside Daniel Cross's chest had already shattered. He remained kneeling in the snow, his coat spread across the shivering shoulders of the 2 little girls. And for the first time in years, he felt powerless, not in the way his rivals dreamed of seeing him, not in the boardroom sense, but in the raw helplessness of realizing these children's lives balanced on the thin edge of warmth he could offer. Lena's wary eyes clung to him with suspicion sharpened by survival, while Emma whimpered softly, her fingers still locked around his sleeve as though she were holding onto the last thread of the world. Daniel had faced hostile takeovers, scandals, and billion-dollar crises without flinching. Yet the sight of this child's trembling grip made his heart hammer with fear. It wasn't fear of losing money, nor fear of reputation. It was the fear of watching fragile life flicker out before his eyes. He knew that if he left them here, if he walked away as every other stranger had, the storm would claim them before dawn. He straightened, snow crunching under his polished shoes, and extended his hand to Lena. Her lips trembled. Mama said not to go with strangers. Her words, so small and so fierce at once, struck him harder than any negotiation tactic he had ever faced. He swallowed, forcing his voice into a whisper that carried both steel and tenderness. Your mama isn't here, but I won't hurt you. I promise. For a moment, Lena stared at him as though she could measure truth by the lines in his face. Her eyes searched for cracks, for shadows, but all she found was the faint gleam of something she had longed for, sincerity. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't pull away when he bent down and scooped Emma into his arms. The little girl's head fell against his chest, too weak to protest, too cold to resist. With his free arm, he lifted Lena, who gasped in surprise but clung to his shoulder when the icy wind cut across her face. Asterisk as he carried them from the bench, footsteps echoed sharply in the distance. The passers-by stopped, their scarves pulled high, their eyes narrowing in recognition. Isn't that Daniel Cross? One muttered, disbelief cutting through the storm. What's he doing with? Their voices trailed off, but Daniel heard them, felt the sting of judgment already brewing. He ignored it, for once. The eyes of the city meant nothing. When he reached the street, his black sedan idled by the curb, its headlights glowing faintly through the snow. His driver leapt out, umbrella in hand, shock spreading across his face when he saw the bundled forms in Daniel's arms. Sir, what on earth? Open the door, Daniel ordered, his voice low but edged with urgency. But sir, the meeting. And forget the meeting. Daniel's tone sliced like ice. Now, the chauffeur obeyed, fumbling with the handle as Daniel slid into the leather interior, pulling the children tight against him. Heat blasted from the vents, but it wasn't enough. Their bodies still shook, teeth chattering as if their small bones were rattling apart. Daniel stripped off his own jacket entirely, wrapping it over them like a shield. Emma whimpered and pressed her face deeper into his chest, while Lena finally let out a sound that was neither a sob nor a word, just the release of a burden too heavy for a child to carry. Where to, sir? The driver asked, voice tight. Daniel hesitated. His penthouse, a sterile palace of glass and steel, had never been meant for children. Yet he knew no hospital or authority could give them what they needed tonight. Not safety, not warmth, not the certainty of someone who would not walk away. Home, he said finally, his voice graved out asterisk as the car pulled away from the curb. Snow streaked past the windows like falling stars. Daniel sat rigid, his arms tightening around the tiny lives pressed against him. He thought of the board meeting waiting for him, of the headlines that would erupt if anyone discovered the CEO of Cross Global, cradling to abandoned children in the back of a limousine. He thought of everything he had spent years building and, for the first time, he realized how hollow it all would feel if he let these children disappear back into the cold. Lena's voice, muffled against his shoulder, broke the silence. You're not going to leave us two, are you? The question pierced through him like a blade. His jaw clenched, his throat burned. He looked down at the tiny faces nestled against him, to fragile sparks fighting to stay lit. And though he had no right to promise, though the weight of those words could shatter the empire he ruled, he whispered anyway, steady and sure, no, not ever. And in that vow, Daniel Cross felt the world shift beneath him. A shift more powerful than any fortune he had made, more dangerous than any rival he had crushed. For the first time in his life, he was not running toward power, he was running toward responsibility, and the storm outside raged harder, as if testing the strength of the man who had just chosen to fight it. Asterisk. The city lights blurred through the snowfall as the car sped away from the park, but Daniel barely noticed. His arms stayed locked around the girls, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm steadier than his racing heart. Emma's breath was shallow, faint, her small body limp with exhaustion. Lena stayed awake, her wide eyes darting nervously from the window to Daniel's face, as if she was memorizing every movement in case he vanished. Too, like their mother had, Daniel felt her fear press into him more heavily than her small weight. For a man used to boardrooms and skyscrapers, it was a strange thing to hold lives in his arms and feel their trust forming with every passing second. When the sedan slid to a halt in front of his building, the valet stumbled forward with an umbrella, his expression faltering when he saw who Daniel carried. The lobby staff straightened from behind the gleaming marble counters, their rehearsed greetings dying in their throats. As the CEO they only ever saw in stale gray suits now strode across the floor in a snow-damp coat, clutching the shivering children. Daniel didn't glance at them. He didn't explain. He simply walked, his polished shoes striking the marble in sharp echoes. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a picture Daniel barely recognized himself. Daniel Cross, the man who wants to find success by dominance, now bent protectively around the little girls wrapped in his coat. He thought of the headlines if this image leaked: millionaire CEO with mystery children. His rivals would twist it. The press would feast on it. But as Emma stirred faintly against his chest and Lena's fingers clutched tighter at his shoulder, Daniel realized he didn't care. Let the world speculate. These two mattered more than the empire he had built. When the elevator doors opened onto his penthouse, a blast of warm air met them. The vast space stretched out in steel and glass, all sharp edges and immaculate surfaces, designed for power, not comfort. It was a home that had never truly been lived in. Daniel carried the girls across the silent expanse, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the emptiness. He set them gently down near the fireplace, its flames flickering weakly as though waiting for permission to burn brighter. Emma whimpered softly, her small body curling into Lena's side, while Lena looked around the vast room with cautious eyes. The penthouse seemed too large, too clean, almost frightening in its sterility. It was the opposite of warmth, and Daniel felt shame rise in him for the first time in years. All his wealth, all his luxury, and he hadn't built the home he had. Built a fortress, but tonight, it needed to be broken open. He grabbed thick blankets from the linen closet, laying them gently over the children. He crouched low, his face level with theirs, his voice softer than it had been in decades. "You're safe here, I promise." A doctor arrived minutes later, summoned by Daniel's terse call during the car ride. He examined the girls by the firelight, his face grim. "They're dangerously cold. Another hour outside and they might not have survived." The words struck Daniel like thunder. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the image of the snowbound park replayed in his mind, their lashes heavy with ice, their lips cracked from the cold. Lena whispering, "No one's coming for us." He had almost walked past. Almost. The thought made his stomach twist with rage at the world and at himself. When the doctor left, Lena looked at Daniel carefully, her young face carrying more weight than a child should. "Are you going to send U.S. away tomorrow?" she asked. Daniel's chest ached at the question. He saw his own childhood and heard those nights in an empty house, whispering promises to himself because no adult had bothered to make them. He could lie. He could reassure her just for tonight, but something deeper pulled at him, something raw and undeniable. He reached out and brushed the damp strands of hair from her forehead. "I don't send people away," he said quietly. "Not anymore." But even as the words left him, the weight of reality closed in. He had a meeting scheduled in just a few hours, the board demanding his signature on a deal worth billions, a deal the world had been waiting on for months. If he skipped it, the empire he had spent his life building could falter. His reputation could fracture. The markets could shake. He looked back at the girls huddled by the fire, their fragile breaths finally deepening into sleep, and something shifted inside him. For the first time, Daniel Cross was standing between two worlds, the one he had built on power and the one he had just stumbled into, fragile and human. As the storm outside rattled against the windows, the choice began to press on him with a weight no skyscraper could match. He poured himself a glass of water, staring into the fire, the reflection of two small faces flickering in the flames. He knew what the board would say if he walked away. He knew the papers, the whispers, the betrayal that would follow. But he also knew this: if he abandoned Lena and Emma, he would never forgive himself. The night stretched on, heavy with snow and silence. Daniel stood there, the firelight painting shadows across his face, knowing that dawn would bring a decision, one that could end his career or save his soul. The storm quieted by morning, but inside Daniel Cross's penthouse the air was heavy, pressing down like a secret no one could afford to speak aloud. The girls were still asleep by the fire, their small forms wrapped tightly in blankets. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching them as though afraid they might vanish if he blinked. Their fragile breathing seemed louder than the city itself, steady reminders that he had crossed an invisible line during the night one that separated who he had been from who he was becoming. The skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows glowed with first light. Normally Daniel would have been in motion by now, his mornings filled with calls from Tokyo, messages from London, and reports piled high on his tablet. Today, the tablet sat unopened on the counter. His phone buzzed relentlessly, board members demanding upgrades, journalists sniffing out his absence from the midnight deal signing. But Daniel couldn't move toward it. Each vibration of that phone sounded hollow compared to the soft exhale of Emma's breath, or the faint stirring of Lena's hand as it clutched the edge of the blanket. He closed his eyes, and the fire's crackle pulled loose a memory buried so deep he had spent decades suffocating it. A boy no older than Lena lying awake in a dark, silent house. His father's voice had been gone for months. His mother's footsteps had faded into nothingness. The boy had whispered to the walls, "Someone will come," but no one had. That boy had grown into a man who built towers of steel and glass, so high he could look down on the city, believing distance was safety. Yet now, as Daniel looked at Lena's furrowed brow even in sleep, he realized he had only ever been building walls against the same ache she carried. The sudden buzz of the intercom jolted him back. His driver's voice crackled through. "Sir, the board has gathered downtown. They say the press is already there." Daniel's jaw tightened. This was supposed to be the crowning moment of his career, the final stroke on a deal that would stretch his empire across continents. Investors expected his signature, rivals expected his presence, and yet, as he glanced at the fire where two abandoned girls slept in borrowed safety, the thought of leaving them even for an hour sent a chill deeper than last night's snow. He moved toward the window, the city sprawling below like a chessboard he had once mastered. For the first time, he felt no hunger for it. What good were towers if children froze beneath them? What good was power if he couldn't keep the fragile lives safe? Behind him, Lena stirred, her small voice startling him. "Is it morning?" she whispered, blinking against the light. She looked smaller in his penthouse than she had on the bench, her eyes wide, wary, still half expecting him to tell her it was time to go. "It's morning." Daniel answered softly, "Are we staying here?" Her voice cracked on the last word, a quiet plea buried beneath caution. Daniel crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead with hands that had once signed contracts worth billions, but never before offered comfort. "You're safe here," he said, his voice lower, steadier. "You're not going anywhere." Emma stirred at Lena's side and whimpered, her face pressing deeper into the blanket. Daniel felt something break inside him again, the same helplessness he'd felt as a child, the same vow he had whispered in silence, "If no one came for me, then one day I will come for someone." He hadn't realized until this moment that the vow had been waiting all these years to be fulfilled. The intercom buzzed again. This time it wasn't the driver. A clipped, stern voice carried through. "Mr. Cross, the board is demanding your immediate attendance. The deal will collapse without you." Daniel's silence stretched. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, the face of a man the world called ruthless, untouchable. But standing in that reflection now was also Lena, clutching the blanket with white knuckles, and Emma, breathing shallowly in her sleep. They didn't need a CEO. They needed a man who wouldn't walk away. He turned back to the fire, and for the first time in decades, Daniel Cross chose to ignore the world outside. "Tell them," he said into the intercom, his voice carrying the finality of thunder, "that the deal can wait." A pause of shocked silence followed, then static as the line cut off. Daniel stood very still, his heart pounding. He knew what he had just done. The fallout would come: headlines, betrayal, perhaps even the collapse of everything he had built. But as Lena slowly reached out and placed her tiny hand over his, whispering almost to herself, "You stayed," Daniel knew there was no regret. The storm outside had ended, but a greater storm was coming, the storm of a world that would never understand why Daniel Cross, the coldest CEO in the city, had thrown away a billion-dollar empire for the forgotten children. As the firelight flickered across his face, he welcomed it. The storm outside had calmed, but a different storm was gathering beyond the glass walls of Daniel Cross's penthouse. Morning sunlight spilled over the city, illuminating the glittering skyline he once ruled effortlessly, but Daniel barely noticed. The fire still crackled softly in the hearth. its glow dancing across the fragile forms of Lena and Emma, curled beneath heavy blankets. Their cheeks were warmer now, their lips no longer cracked by the cold, but their breaths still carried the fragility of survival. Daniel had not slept. He sat in a leather chair a few feet away, his eyes locked on them as though his presence alone could keep the world at bay. The phone on the table beside him buzzed relentless messages from his board, his executives, even the press. His absence from the midnight deal had not gone unnoticed. And now, whispers were turning into headlines. The first strike came swiftly. His assistant's trembling voice echoed through the speakerphone. "Sir, the media is running with photographs from last night. Someone caught you in the park carrying 2 children in your arms." Daniel froze. He could almost hear the shudders of those cameras in his memory, though he hadn't noticed them in the snow. His image-polished shoes sinking into ice. Expensive coat spread across shivering shoulders was already splashed across every screen in the city. The assistant continued, her voice cracking. "The tabloids are calling them your secret daughters. Investors are panicking. The board is demanding an emergency session. They think this," she hesitated, then whispered, "this scandal could ruin everything." Daniel's jaw clenched. Scandal. He turned his eyes back to the 2 sleeping children, their innocence untouched by the cruel machinery of the world. How could saving them be twisted into shame? But the world did not see children on a bench. The world saw weakness, it saw leverage, and Daniel knew his empire had always fed on such stories, devouring vulnerability to build power. Now that same beast was turning on him. The board meeting came not as a polite summons, but as an intrusion. By afternoon, his living room was filled with sharp suits and sharper words. The men and women who had once praised him now circled like vultures, their voices cutting through the sterile air. "You've lost control of the narrative, Daniel," one barked. "We have the deal of the decade in our grasp, and you throw it away for what? Strays?" Another leaned forward, venom in his tone. "Do you have any idea how this looks? 2 children appearing out of nowhere, and you carrying them home? The shareholders think you've lost your mind." Daniel stood near the window, his back rigid, his hands clenched behind him. The city stretched endlessly below, towers he had built now glimmering like monuments to a life that suddenly felt hollow. He didn't turn to face them. His voice came low, steady, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "They're not strays," he said. "They're children. Children left to die in the snow while the world looked away." A scoff rose from the table. "This isn't about sentiment. It's about survival. Yours and the company's. If you want to play the hero, do it in silence. Hand the girls over to social services. Clean this mess before it devours us all." Daniel turned then, his gaze sharp enough to freeze the air. "You think handing them over will erase their suffering? That shoving them back into a system that abandons more than it saves will protect our reputation? You're wrong. The only thing that will erase us is pretending their lives don't matter." The room erupted, voices colliding in anger, fear, calculation, but above their arguments, another sound pierced through soft footsteps. Lena stood in the doorway, barefoot on the marble, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, wet, as she listened. Are you going to leave us too?" The words silenced everyone. Daniel's chest tightened, the air leaving him in a rush. He saw in her eyes the same fear he had once carried as a boy, the same hollow expectation that every adult eventually walked away. For her, overhearing this moment wasn't business, it was betrayal waiting to happen. He crossed the room in swift strides, kneeling in front of her so his face was level with hers. "No," he said, his voice breaking with a conviction that cut through the board's murmurs. "I am not leaving you. Not now. Not ever." Behind him, the board hissed, muttered, threatened, but their noise no longer mattered. Daniel's world had shifted entirely. For the first time in his life, he wasn't protecting an empire. He was protecting the fragile lives. As he gathered Lena into his arms, shielding her from the board stares, he knew the cost of his promise. He would lose allies. He might lose his company. The world would tear at him, hungry for weakness. But as Emma stirred in the blankets by the fire, reaching out blindly for the sister who had stepped away, Daniel realized the truth. He wasn't weak. For the first time in his life, he was strong because he had something worth fighting for that money could never buy. The board's voices faded into background noise. A storm far more dangerous than last night's snow was about to break, and Daniel Cross The man once known for ruthless control was about to face it not with contracts or towers, but with the fragile trust of two little girls who believed he would stay. Asterisk, the storm Daniel feared most was no longer in the sky, it was in the headlines. By dawn, his face was everywhere. News anchors spoke his name with confusion and contempt. Billionaire CEO found with two mysterious children, scandal or secret? The tabloids screamed louder. Daniel Cross hiding twin daughters, investors panicked, stocks trembled, and the board fumed, for the empire Daniel had built brick by brick. It was the beginning of collapse, but inside his penthouse, a different world existed. Lena and Emma sat on the rug before the fire, their hair still damp from the baths he had drawn for them. Their small frames wrapped in clothes far too big, his shirts tied with belts, sleeves rolled high. The penthouse, once sterile and cold, was beginning to look lived in. Toys and blankets cluttered the floor. Crumbs from the breakfast he had clumsily prepared dotted the counter. The chaos of children had entered a space designed for silence. For the first time, Daniel didn't mind the mess, yet the storm outside pressed harder every hour. That morning, the board stormed it again. Their suits were darker, their words sharper. The shareholders want blood. One barked, "Your absence last night cost us $3 billion in market value. If you don't sever ties with those girls today, you're finished." Daniel stood at the window, watching the snow melting from the streets far below. He didn't turn when he spoke. "Then I'm finished." The room erupted. "You're throwing away everything you've built over two children you don't even know." Finally, Daniel turned, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that demanded silence. "I know enough. I know they were left to die in the snow while men like us drank champagne in towers. I know the world looked away, and so did you, and I know I won't make that mistake again." The board's fury was absolute, but their power was breaking against something they couldn't control. Daniel had made a choice, and no threat of money or empire could reverse it. That night, when the girls were asleep, Daniel sat alone by the fire, memories clawing at him. He remembered a boy himself curled up in a dark house, whispering to shadows, waiting for a mother who never returned. The pain of that silence had shaped him, hardened him, turned him into the man the world feared. But as he stared at Lena's sleeping face, her hand curled protectively round Emma's, Daniel realized he had been wrong all his life. Strength wasn't in walls or wealth. It was in staying when no one else did. Asterisk, the press was relentless. Photographers camped outside his building, flashing bulbs whenever he stepped near a window. Reporters shouted questions that echoed off the marble lobby. "Mr. Cross, are these your illegitimate children? Are you covering up a scandal? Are you stepping down as CEO?" Daniel shielded Lena and Emma from it all, carrying them past the chaos with his head high, his arms steady. Each flash of a camera only deepened his resolve. Then came the blow he expected but dreaded. A legal summons. The girl's mother had resurfaced. She had seen the headlines, smelled the money, and now demanded her daughters back. She stood before the cameras weeping crocodile tears, claiming she had left them only for a moment, that Daniel had stolen them for publicity. The world ate up her words, desperate for a villain died inside the penthouse. Lena heard the news on television. Her small body trembled as she turned to Daniel, her eyes brimming. "She's going to take us away, isn't she?" Asterisk, Daniel knelt before her, his chest tightening at the fear in her voice. "Not if I can help it." And he meant it. He would fight with everything he had, not with money or power, but with truth. For the first time in his life, Daniel Cross prepared for a battle he could not afford to lose, not because of contracts or towers, but because of two fragile girls who had taught him what it meant to live. The court date loomed like a storm on the horizon. The world whispered that Daniel Cross was finished, but as he looked at Lena and Emma, their hands clutching his, as though he were the last safe place in the world, Daniel knew he had never been more ready to fight. Asterisk, the courthouse was packed long before Daniel Cross arrived. Reporters clustered on the steps, their microphones rising like spears. Flashbulbs burst against the gray morning sky, the frenzy of a world hungry for scandal. The billionaire with two mysterious girls, truth or lie, headlines had been screaming for days, painting him as a thief, a manipulator, a man who had stolen children to soften his cold image. And now, the city waited for the verdict that would decide not just his career, but the fragile futures of Lena and Emma. The black sedan eased to the curb, and the crowd erupted. Daniel stepped out, his jaw hard, his coat heavy against the winter wind. But he wasn't alone. In each hand, he carried a small one, Lena on his left, Emma on his right. Their tiny frames seemed to shrink beneath the flashing cameras, but Daniel's grip was steady, his broad shoulders shielding them from the noise. He didn't glance at the reporters. He didn't answer their questions. All that mattered were the two trembling hands clutching his dot inside. The courtroom buzzed. With whispers, the mother was already there. She sat with her lawyer, her hair freshly styled, her dress chosen to look modest, her eyes glistening with rehearsed tears. She looked nothing like the woman who had left her daughters on a bench in the snow. To the unknowing eye, she looked like a grieving parent desperate to reclaim her children. The performance was perfect, almost. The judge's gavel silenced the room. This hearing will decide custody of the minors Lena and Emma. The mother's lawyer rose first, his voice dripping with righteousness. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. My client is their biological mother. She was momentarily overwhelmed by hardship, but she never abandoned her children. Mr. Cross, he sneered Daniel's name, exploited the situation for attention. He is not family. He is not blood. He is a stranger. The mother dabbed her eyes delicately, nodding as though the words were truth carved in stone. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniel sat silent, his hands folded, his gaze steady. He could feel Lena trembling beside him, could hear Emma's tiny sniffles as she clutched the sleeve of his coat. His instinct was to shield them, too, storm out and protect them from this spectacle. But he stayed, because this wasn't about him, it was about making the world hear the truth. The girls were too small to shout. When his turn came, Daniel stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with theatrics. He simply held up a thin folder and handed it to the judge. Inside, he said quietly, "You'll find signed documents, bank withdrawals, a notarized agreement." The courtroom stilled as the judge flipped through the papers. Gasps broke out in the gallery. The truth spilled into the silence. The mother had taken cash from strangers in exchange for signing away her claim to the children. She had left them on that bench not in a moment of hardship, but in cold calculation. Her plan had been abandonment profitable, permanent. The mother's face drained of color. "That's not true. Those papers are lies," she cried, her voice cracking with panic. But the evidence was undeniable. The signatures were hers. The bank trails were clear. Her lawyer's face turned pale, his mouth tightening as though the ground had dropped beneath him. Daniel turned then, not to the judge, not to the lawyers, but to Lena and Emma. He knelt on the courtroom floor, his hands reaching for theirs. His voice, low but unshakable, carried louder than any headline. "I promised you I wouldn't leave, and I meant it. No one will ever take you away again, not while I breathe." Lena's lips trembled, her eyes brimming. Emma buried her face against his shoulder, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. In that moment, the courtroom ceased to exist. The flashing cameras, the scribbling reporters, the gasping crowd, all of it faded against the simple image of a man kneeling before two children, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as the father they had been waiting for. The judge cleared his throat, his voice carrying finality. "Custody is granted to Daniel Cross." The gavel struck, and the room erupted in chaos, some in outrage, some in awe. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, but Daniel didn't hear them. He lifted both girls into his arms, his coat wrapping around them as the sound of applause and shouts tangled in the air. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the city in white. As Daniel stepped onto the courthouse steps with Lena and Emma clinging to him, the world that once mocked him as ruthless and cold now watched in silence. They had expected a scandal. They had expected a downfall. Instead, they witnessed a man's redemption. Daniel Cross had lost his empire, but he had gained something greater, a family. And as the snowflakes melted against the girls' lashes, they no longer looked like crystals of sorrow. They looked like fragments of light, proof that even in the coldest winter, warmth could be found.